want to do to start out is give you some background information about where we are as an industry in terms of vaccine use and how are we as an industry making use of these technologies. So if any of you are familiar with the National Animal Health Monitoring System or NAM studies that are published by the USDA, they're a survey that the USDA does about every 10 years for different segments of animal agriculture, and they just give us kind of a snapshot of how things are done in the industry at that particular time. And so the last one we have available for cow-calf producers or operations is 2007 and 2008. They did another survey back just 2017, 2018, but that data is not published yet. It was supposed to be out in December of last year, but it's not quite available. They're running behind. So these numbers are a little bit dated, so hopefully when the new data comes out, we'll maybe see some improvements. But this is an excerpt from that survey, and one of the small pieces of data that came out of that very large survey. And it was just a survey of beef cow-calf producers and how they utilize vaccines on their operations. To be classified as a beef cow-calf producer in this study, you had to own one cow. So as long as you own one cow, you were classified as a beef cow-calf producer. And so they went in and just asked, about using vaccines. And they took that data and broke it down based on the size of the herd. And so if you have less than 50 cows in your herd, you fell in this category here. And if you were a big producer with more than 200, you fell in this category over here. Anybody know what the average herd size for the Oklahoma beef cow-calf producer is? 40. Yep. So the average producer in Oklahoma has 40 cows. That's right at the national average. And we've been right at 40 cows for the last 8 or 10 years. It hadn't changed much. So our average producer falls in this category, and the average producer nationwide falls in that category. And so the question here was, do you use any vaccine on your operation in any animals? So do you give a vaccine to any bovine on your operation? They didn't specify for this part what kind or what type of cattle. Just did you give a vaccine? And so that you can see that in this category of smaller producers, where most of our producers lie, only 60% of them used a vaccine. So there's 40% of producers out there that didn't use any vaccine whatsoever on their cow-calf operation. As you go up in herd size, that changes, right? So the majority of these larger producers are utilizing vaccines in some form, but there's lots of room for improvement, because remember, this is where most of our producers fall. That's not where most of the cows are. Any idea what percentage of the beef cow inventory is contained in this category? About 80% of the beef producers fall in this category, but they only have about 28% of the cows. So we've got a lot of producers out there that aren't utilizing any vaccine, at least based on this data. And maybe it'll be different when the new stuff, when the new 10-year later data comes out, but we haven't had a chance to see that yet. Take that same data and break it down by region geographically, and Oklahoma falls in this category here. Central was Kansas going north, and then west was some of the western states. The number's about the same. About 60% of the operations are utilizing vaccine, and that makes sense because we know most of our producers fall in that category, so that's where most of us fall. And as you go west, where the ranches tend to get bigger, then you see a higher utilization of vaccines in some sort. That same study went in a little bit more specifically and pulled out data specific to respiratory vaccination of calves and clostridial vaccination of calves, and found that when we looked at how many operations vaccinated calves for respiratory disease prior to weaning, that number is only 30%. So 1/3 of operations are vaccinating calves for respiratory disease. When we look at blackleg vaccines or clostridial vaccines, that number jumps up to about 60%. About 60% of operations at this time were utilizing blackleg vaccine at some point prior to weaning the calves. This study was a 2017 study, so a more recent study. This is a survey of veterinarians, survey of cow-calf veterinarians, so veterinarians that provide service to you as a cow-calf producer in both the U.S. and Canada. And I can't remember how many were surveyed in it, but we can look it up if you're interested. And they found that veterinary practitioners, when they asked them, they said that 93% of their cow-calf operation clients have a vaccine program in place. Now, those numbers don't really match up very well, do they? So we say that 93% of operations or producers have a vaccine program, but only 60% of producers in those smaller herds are utilizing vaccines in some way. Maybe that's because times have gotten better, just those 9 years later from the previous data, or maybe there's a discrepancy there that we're not sure about. So we're going to talk quite a bit as we go through this discussion about modified live versus killed viral vaccines. And so they ask questions about what do you recommend as a veterinarian in terms of vaccines versus modified live versus killed. And in pre-weaned calves, so calves prior to weaning, 90% of veterinarians are recommending using live vaccines, and only 10% were recommending killed. And when those calves were weaned, that number jumped up a little bit to about 93% of veterinarians recommending live products, and only 7% recommending killed. So there's a large advantage or favorability to the modified live products over the killed products, at least in the eyes of veterinarians who were in this survey. So just kind of do that to kind of give you an idea of where we are in terms of utilizing vaccine as an industry. I think many times we kind of depend on vaccine as a crutch, or we expect vaccine to be a silver bullet that's going to solve all of our problems, and that's just not the case. So I think it's important to kind of remember when we start talking about vaccination, always remember that it's just a tool. It's just one tool in a toolbox of many tools that we can use to try to improve animal health. And remember that just because we poke a needle through the hide of that animal and inject something in it, that does not mean we've necessarily immunized that animal. There's a lot of factors that come into play into how that animal responds to the vaccine. So we've got to do our job and administer it correctly. That means we've got to keep it out of the sun, keep it cool. Dr. Biggs talked to you this morning about vaccine handling, so got to really think about that and pay a lot of attention to that, because we can, particularly with modified live products, they're not very robust, and it's pretty easy to denature or inactivate those products, and then you're really just giving some dirty water at that point. There's not enough virus in those products to do much if they're not replicating. We've got to give the appropriate dosage. Don't mix vaccines together in the same syringe. Don't cut the dose in half to make the cost less. All those affect efficacy. Follow the label route of administration, and then appropriate boosters is a big one. If we're using killed vaccines, the first time you give a killed vaccine to an animal, you have to go back and booster that in 3 to 4 weeks, or you're wasting your time giving it to start with. It does not produce any protective immunity the first time you administer it until that animal gets that booster vaccine, because those killed products don't replicate at all in the animal, and therefore they induce some memory in the immune system. They kind of prime the immune system, but they don't produce any really protective immunity. They have to have a booster no earlier than 2 weeks. 3 to 4 weeks is probably better, and then that window can probably be a little longer, but we don't know what the maximum extent of that window is. You know, if we go 90 days between vaccinations, we're probably not getting a true booster response. We're probably kind of starting over and giving another initial vaccine if we wait that long. But we don't have data to say how long that window can be. But we know if we give it any earlier than 2 weeks, then that's too early, and the immune system hasn't had time to get ready for that second shot yet. We'll talk a little bit about herd immunity in a minute, and we'll talk about maybe there's some advantage to boostering modified lives as well, but with the killed products, it's an absolute necessity the first time you do it. Now, if you're using them in cows and you get them done twice the first time, then you can come back once a year with an annual booster, and that works okay. But the first time the animal sees that vaccine, in order to get that protective immune response established, they have to be boosted appropriately. And then when we do everything right, we still got to depend on the animal to do its part, right? So part of a vaccine efficacy is us getting the vaccine put in the animal correctly, and then part of it is the animal responding to that vaccine in the appropriate way. And there's a lot of things that impact that. The age of the animal. We're going to talk quite a bit about that here toward the end, about some of the challenges that we are learning about when we vaccinate calves when they still have colostral immunity from their mother, and how those might interfere with vaccination. Previous exposure, maybe they've been exposed before, so they've already got some immunity established. Nutrition is massive. Nutrition is huge. An animal that's not in a good plane of nutrition is not going to have an optimally functional immune system, and therefore they're not going to be able to respond to a vaccine as readily as they should be able to if they had better nutrition. So thinking about the nutrition of your calves, if you're buying stocker calves, thinking about what their nutrition's been prior to you getting them, all that impacts their response to your vaccine program. We're going to talk some more about maternal immunity or colostral immunity here in a little bit. Stress is a massive one as well. We all know that stress suppresses the immune system. And when calves are stressed, they don't respond to vaccine as well as they should, as well as they could if they weren't stressed. So we're going to talk some more about that here toward the end too, and about maybe some value in delaying some vaccination, particularly in stocker and feeder calves. And if you're a stocker producer and you're buying lightweight calves from the sale barn or getting them from an order buyer somewhere, those typical kind of high-risk commingled calves, a lot of those calves are already sick in many cases. And when they have already concurrent infection going on, their immune system is busy. It's taxed, right, with fighting what's already going on. And now we stick a vaccine in them and we ask them to do more from an immune standpoint, and many times they just can't do more. and so we don't get much of a response to those vaccines if that animal is already fighting a concurrent infection. So if we do our job right and the animal does its job right, we still only get that protective immune response about 70% of the time. So we can go through 100 animals and vaccinate them, everything done like it should be, and we're still not going to get every animal in that population immunized. So that's important to remember from the standpoint of what we call herd immunity or population immunity. We look at the whole population and what is the level of protection in that population of animals rather than looking at the individual animal. What we want to do is maximize our herd immunity so that the risk of an outbreak of disease is less. So the fewer animals that are in that population that are susceptible to the disease, then the less our risk of an outbreak of disease, because there aren't as many susceptible animals to share the infection with. And so in many cases, I think there's an advantage to boostering even a modified live vaccine, because we know that only about 70% of them are going to respond. So we're leaving 30% of the herd unprotected, but we don't know who those 30% are, right? There's no way, unless we measure antibody response or some sort of immune response, we don't know who they are. And so I think there's some advantage in some circumstances to go back and revaccinate everybody, booster everybody again. Those animals that respond to that first modified live vaccine probably don't need a booster, but we just don't know who they are. And so go back in and give everybody a second round and try to pick up the majority of that 30% that we missed the first time, and that brings that level of population immunity up a lot higher. So then the risk of having a large-scale outbreak is much, much less in that circumstance. So we're just going to talk a little bit about vaccine types. These are probably familiar to you. When we have the whole debate about modified live versus killed viral vaccine, that's referring to viral vaccines. That's BVD, that's IBR, those are the two big ones. We're not talking about any bacterial products there. The only modified live bacterial vaccine that we use is the brucellosis vaccine, and that's one that we have to come out and administer to the animals and ID them and do all the things, Baines vaccination. None of the routinely used vaccines other than that one of our bacterial vaccines are live. So the whole modified live versus killed debate is about viral vaccine. When we talk about lepto vaccine, that falls in this category. It's a killed bacteria. Our clostridial vaccines are kind of a combination. So a toxoid is a vaccine that specifically targets a toxin rather than the bacteria itself. So like a tetanus toxoid vaccine is a toxoid. And so the blackleg vaccines are kind of a combination of these two. And then we have viral vaccines that are both either modified live or killed. And so we'll talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages of those as we go along. These are the common pathogens or infectious agents that we might think about including in a respiratory disease vaccine program. The big ones are BVD, both type 1 and type 2, and IBR. And so if you look at a vaccine label and it's a 5-way viral vaccine, that means it includes BVD, IBR, this bovine respiratory syncytial virus, and PI3 or parainfluenza virus. The way they get those products to be a 5-way viral is that they include both type 1 and type 2 BVD. So there's two BVDs in there that are antigenically different. They're different from an immune response standpoint. Those viruses are different, even though they're both BVD. And then the other three make it a 5-way. But for the majority of beef producers in the U.S., the two that are really important are BVD and IBR. Those are the most important ones. The BRSV, in some circumstances, it can cause significant clinical disease. It tends to be more of a disease of dairy cattle where calves are housed and raised indoors. It tends to be a more common disease-causing agent there. Occasionally might see issues in beef calves otherwise out on pasture, but not very commonly. And the PI3 virus is really kind of a wimpy virus that isn't that significant in most circumstances. There's a growing body of evidence that there's a bovine coronavirus or more than one that play a role in respiratory disease. And this is no relation to what's going on in the world currently with human coronavirus. This has been known for several years. So you may see something about that. There are no vaccines currently available for bovine respiratory coronavirus, and we're still trying to kind of figure out what the role of that virus might be in the whole BRD complex. But you may run across that and see some information about it at some point. And there may be a vaccine available at some point, but there isn't one currently. There are coronavirus vaccines on the market, but they're diarrheal vaccines. They're for administering to cows to boost colostral immunity for baby calves. And there's one or two that's actually made to give directly to a newborn calf when it's first born. but they're for preventing scours, not for respiratory disease. The coronavirus that's in those is slightly different. And then the primary bacteria that we worry about with pneumonia is this Mannheimia hemolytica and Pasteurella. Those are the two big ones. Histophilus can be a significant player in some circumstances. We don't see a lot of Histophilus here, but if you go further north, it seems to be a little more common. And then if you probably all dealt with mycoplasma to some degree, particularly if you deal with lightweight stalker calves, you're going to have some mycoplasma. There is not a mycoplasma vaccine available on the market, so it is not one that we target with the vaccine at all. There's not. Actually, there may be one out there, but it doesn't do any good, so we don't use mycoplasma vaccines. And then the other common vaccine that we're going to use in calves is going to be a clostridial vaccine or blackleg vaccine. That's probably familiar to all of you. Blackleg is the one that we're most concerned about, but there's a variety of other things in there. And so that's important to remember. We see a lot of combination vaccines that are maybe 10-way or 11-way vaccines, or these can be 7 or 8-way vaccines. And just remember that maybe you might only be giving that animal maybe 2 injections, but you might be giving it 20 different things to respond to with some of these big combination products. And so keep that in mind, particularly if you're vaccinating young, lightweight, stressed calves, is that you're asking their immune system to do a whole lot at one time when we give them all these different things to respond to. And so there may be some advantages to trying to alter those or spread those out a little bit over time, or maybe target them where we're utilizing just what they need to be used. So I think a common example with this would be is we don't need to be giving lepto vaccines to calves. Lepto is a reproductive disease, and so we give that to cows, but we don't need to be giving that same viral plus lepto to calves, because then we're asking that calf to respond to 10 things rather than 5 things in its immune response, and it doesn't need that lepto response, particularly if it's a steer. It doesn't need it at all. And so there's no point asking its immune system to respond to that, and there's no point paying a few extra pennies per dose for that lepto component that you don't really need in that vaccine for that particular animal. So I think it's important to take a step back and think about herd health from more of a kind of a holistic, kind of big picture point of view. Rather than just focusing just on vaccination, because we always think about vaccination as the kind of the cornerstone of herd health, and it really is just a tool. There's so many other things that impact animal health that vaccination is not the kind of linchpin of our herd health programs in many circumstances. But we've got to think about the source of the calves. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Other things that's going on in that calf, other stresses, castration, what are its nutritional stresses, how able is its immune system to respond? Can it respond like it's supposed to? What role does the weather play? Commingling, we're going to talk about that quite a bit. That's a big environmental challenge. And then the pathogens. And so you can have all these pathogens in place, and you can have weather challenges, but until you get the interaction of all those things together, you don't typically see disease. And this is one of the things that makes bovine respiratory disease so challenging to figure out. We've been researching this disease for 50 or 60 years, and we really haven't made any progress. There's just as many cattle dying today of pneumonia as there was 50 years ago, even though we have much better drugs, we have much better antibiotics, much better vaccines. So there's so many factors that go into it. There's some people that are looking at the possibility that we've changed in our push toward better growth and performance of calves. Maybe we've genetically altered their immune resistance, and we've got cattle now that are less resistant to disease, even though they grow better, but they just are less resistant to disease, and maybe that's why we haven't made any progress. We don't know, but it's a very multifactorial disease, and there's not just one simple answer to it. And vaccination is a player in that, but it's not the only answer. And you can't depend on vaccination to solve all of your respiratory disease problems. So the source of calves plays a big role in how much sickness you're going to have to deal with and how much headache you're going to have dealing with this. So if you're a stocker producer, the source that you get those calves from is going to make a big difference on how you maybe manage them. The ideal scenario will be to purchase home-raised calves that come, or that, maybe not purchase them, you raised them, so you know their whole story. You've had control of them from the beginning, and you know what their health history is. You know what the health history of their dams was. How are their dams vaccinated? You know all of that. You know their nutritional history. That's kind of the ideal scenario, but most stocker producers don't have enough cows to produce enough calves to fill the stocker operation either, and so we're going to go out and purchase calves somewhere in most circumstances. The best case scenario for purchasing calves is to go out and try to buy them directly off their ranch of origin. So we take somebody else's home-raised calves and buy them directly off of where they were born and raised. Therefore, they're not commingled. They aren't mixed together with a bunch of kids from other places. They're not all sharing all the different germs, and so their disease challenge is going to be less. We might do that through direct purchase or through some market channels, some special sales or something like that. This is kind of the target where the OQBN calf sales come into play, is kind of trying to it's kind of it's not exactly this because those calves do get commingled to some degree, but it's a improvement over this situation, trying to more closely mimic this situation here. But the classic, the kind of typical beef calf that most of you are familiar with if you do stocker calves, are these market purchase calves that have no known background. We don't know anything about their background. We don't know where they came from. They're commingled, and we really don't even know how many different places they're commingled from. So there's been some studies that have looked at how much variation in source is there in a load of stocker calves arriving at an operation, and I can't remember where they were done, but if you've also gone to a sale barn and seen the yellow back tag stickers that get put on cattle. If you go to Oklahoma City and buy a semi-load of stocker calves, they're not going to put those on all those calves. But if you go to a smaller auction that's selling 1 or 2 calves at a time, they're going to stick one of those stickers on that calf as a way to track it. And each one of those stickers tells you exactly what sale barn that calf was sold at. Every sale barn has its own code that's on those stickers. And there's been some studies that have looked at how many different stickers are on calves when they come off a semi at a feed yard or a stocker operation. And sometimes there might be 50 to 70 different operations. There's some situations where nearly every calf came from a different origin in some of those circumstances. So you can just imagine the level of commingling and pathogen sharing that's in those circumstances. Now that's not every load by any means, but that's a possibility. And so there's lots of commingling, and that commingling is a major challenge for those animals. It's a major challenge from a disease pathogen standpoint because they all share their germs, right? So when your kids go back to school for the first time, everybody kind of gets sick. All those kids come back together and they all kind of share their germs, right? So I know when my kids were little, they'd go back to daycare and everybody gets sick for a little while because they're all sharing all their bugs with each other. And then eventually they all get immune to each other's junk, and then everybody settles down and does pretty good. But that first period of commingling is when we see most of our illness. Same thing happens in our calves. But that commingling is also a social stress. Those calves don't know each other, and so they don't have their social hierarchy established, and so there's a social stress there too. Shipping is a stress, we know that, and not just the distance traveled and the time on the truck, but there's been studies that have looked at the incidence of BRD depending on where the calf stood in the trailer. So the semi-trailers have different compartments, and the calves that were in the top section of that trailer in the front got to breathe a lot more diesel smoke on the way here than the calves that were in other parts of the trailer, and there actually is a higher incidence of respiratory disease in those calves than calves that came off the same trailer but from a different spot on the trailer. And so there's lots of factors that impact the disease risk in these calves. If you're buying calves through an order buyer, how good is that order buyer doing their job, and how long does it take them to get a load of calves put together? If those calves get bought and go to their house and they sit there for a week while they're going to different sales trying to get your load put together, if you are buying calves and they're sick and they die the day or 3 days after you get them, they were sick when you got them. And because it takes about 7 to 10 days for a calf to get sick once it gets exposed to these pathogens. So if they sit around at an order buyer's place, they're sitting there cooking that infection, and then all of a sudden they get delivered to you and start dying, they're already sick. And there's not much you can do to get out of those wrecks. Many times you're stuck in those. So who's doing the purchasing, how long does it take to get a load put together, all those things impact the health of those calves. So their previous history is going to have a big impact, and again, with those lightweight, high-risk calves, we just often don't know what their history is. We don't know anything about them. But all these things work together to determine their level of disease challenge that we expect to have in those calves. And just if you're going to purchase those lightweight calves, those high-risk calves, you're just going to have to be ready to deal with more sickness in those calves. And it's just something you have to accept. There's opportunity sometimes there to make money on those calves if you can get them bought cheap enough. But you just have to know you're going to deal with more sickness. And there's no magic antibiotic or there's no magic vaccine that's going to solve that problem. It's just going to be an issue. So just have to be prepared for that. So we like to categorize things, and so we categorize these calves into different risk categories based on their source and their history. And so those lightweight calves, those commingled calves, are what we call high-risk exposed. They're high risk, they're stressed, they've been commingled, so they're exposed to lots of pathogens. Maybe they've been through a couple different order buyer channels. they've had all the different opportunities in the world to get sick. They're high risk exposed. High risk unexposed would be some of those ranch direct calves that haven't been commingled. They're still young, still fairly lightweight calves, but they haven't had the commingling pressure that some of these calves have had. A little bit less disease risk in those on a typically. And then the low risk one, which we'd all like to do, are these yearlings. If you can buy older, heavier cattle, they're older, they're more robust, they've been exposed to more things. The weak ones have already died and have kind of fallen out of the population, so you've got less disease risk with these cattle than you do with young, lightweight, fresh weaned calves. These cost more, right? So they might be harder to make money on depending on the market situation, but you're going to have less disease challenge with these than you're going to have with freshly weaned, lightweight, commingled calves. So this I want to show you a study. It's a little bit older study now from 2008. It was done by Dr. D.L. Stett. Many of you may know him. He used to do a lot of these kind of presentations when he was at OSU. He's in industry now. But they wanted to look at the impact of weaning and vaccination on calf health. And so what they did is they went up north somewhere, I forget where it was, Montana I want to say, and bought some calves directly off a ranch, off their ranch of origin, and brought those calves to the research feed yard in Stillwater. Some of those calves, they weaned them and shipped them right then. Just pulled them off the cow and put them on the truck, like a typical weaning scenario for many producers. And those calves were this group. This group they kept on the ranch of origin for 45 days, but didn't give them any vaccines. They just kept them on the ranch of origin and weaned them. And then this group they weaned and vaccinated. They got a modified live vaccine like you might do in the OQBN program or something like that. Then they went out over here and bought some market calves. These are just the typical lightweight, high-risk market calves, and they use those as a comparison group. All those calves ended up at the Willard Sparks Research Center in Stillwater for a 42-day receiving period, and they took a subset of these calves and mixed them with these calves to create some additional challenge, and that's this commingled group. And then this group is just the market calves. That's this group with no other mixing with any of these. And they followed those calves all the way through that 42-day receiving period, looked at incidence of BRD, sickness rate, and performance in those calves. And so when they look at overall morbidity, those ranch origin calves as a group had a lot less sickness. So morbidity means sickness, and so they had a lot less morbidity in those ranch origin calves. The market-derived calves had the highest, which would be what you'd expect. And when they mixed these two groups together, they got an intermediate range of sickness. So the ranch origin calves that ended up in this group had a bigger challenge because they got mixed with these calves and shared some of their pathogens. If we look at mortality or death rate, see the same relationship. The ranch origin calves, none of them died. The number was higher for these market calves. It wasn't statistically different, but it was higher for the market calves than it was for the commingled ones. And if we look at the impact of vaccination and weaning, this is, I think, the really interesting part of this study, is that we look at morbidity from BRD, whether those calves were weaned and shipped directly, so they were weaned and put right on the truck, whether they were kept at home for 45 days and vaccinated, or they were kept at home for 45 days but did not get any vaccine. And you can see the differences in sickness there. So a significant difference here. So these calves that got weaned and shipped abruptly had a higher sickness rate, pretty close to what was seen in the market calves. If they were kept at home for 45 days, there was no difference in their sickness rate regardless of whether they were vaccinated or not. So in many circumstances, weaning has a bigger impact on calf health than vaccination. So just getting those calves weaned, getting them through that first few weeks of weaning, preconditioning them, but it impacted health just as much whether they got vaccinated or not. So in this particular study, vaccination wasn't that important, at least for this 42-day period. Now, we wouldn't want to say we're not going to vaccinate them because it may impact them later, but it just demonstrates the importance of preconditioning and weaning and keeping those calves at home and how that can impact their health down the road compared to shipping them right away when they're first pulled off the cow. And like I said before, if you're going to purchase those high-risk, lightweight stocker calves, you just kind of have to be prepared for some bigger headaches in terms of illness. These are a couple of different studies that were looking at different things, but they used the population of high-risk market calves as their population in the study. And you can see how many of them they had to treat for respiratory disease sickness. And nearly every one of them in this study got sick. And they weren't challenging these calves with disease. These are just high-risk calves. When they brought them in for these other studies, they had to deal with this kind of morbidity in these studies. So just got to be prepared for it. They're not all going to be this bad, But it's not uncommon at all to have 30, 40, 50% morbidity rate in some of these lightweight young calves when you get them, particularly if they've been shipped a long distance and commingled a lot. So when we talk about vaccination, we want to evaluate vaccine efficacy. That's going to help us decide, okay, which products are we going to use and is it worth using this product at all? There's a couple ways that we do that. The way that is most common and the way that companies are going to use to get their vaccine labels is what we call an experimental challenge model. We're going to take a population of calves and we're going to vaccinate some of them and we're going to not vaccinate some of them. And then at some point, we're going to challenge those calves with the pathogen in some way, and then we're going to see what the difference is between the vaccinates and the non-vaccinates in the face of that challenge. That's how vaccines get their label. Tells us a lot about how the vaccine works, but the biggest challenge with these in trying to extrapolate these to real life and what you deal with is that these are almost always done in healthy animals. If you read the label on the vaccine, if you read the directions, it'll say administer 2 mils sub-Q in healthy animals, or it's labeled for the prevention of respiratory disease in healthy animals, right? So it's always done in healthy animals. How many of those lightweight commingled calves that you're receiving at your stocker operation are healthy on the day you receive them? Probably none of them are perfectly healthy, right? They're all stressed to some degree. And so we're vaccinating a different animal in that circumstance, and we're depending on a different immune system to try to do its job. But all of our vaccines are done these trials are done in healthy animals, and that's not wrong. It just makes it challenging to take some of this data and apply it to what you deal with in real life, and that probably explains in some circumstances why the response you see in your calves at home may not be as good as what's reported in some of these studies that the companies show you, because these studies are done in healthy animals. So if we can look at field trials, those have a lot more what we call external validity. They are much more applicable to you in real life because they more closely mimic what you're going to do and what you're going to see in real life. And so this is where we take calves, we put them in a stocker operation, or we put them in a feed yard, we vaccinate some, we don't vaccinate some, try to keep everything else the same, and we depend on natural exposure, natural disease challenge as a disease challenge. We don't go back in and give those animals some sort of infectious agent to challenge them. And we just depend on nature to do its thing, and we see what the difference is at the end based on the treatment that they received. They're less controlled, so they're a little harder to conduct, but the big challenge with these is that it takes a large number of animals to do these studies. And so that's why they're very expensive to conduct. These can be done with a much smaller number of animals in a more controlled environment. These are much less controlled and takes a very large number of animals. So we'll see some of these that have, in feedlot studies, they may have 4,000, 5,000, 8,000 animals in a study. And so it takes a lot of animals and it's very expensive to conduct. When we go to look at the published studies that are out there and try to make recommendations based off of studies, it can be really challenging because studies are done in so many different ways. And it's sometimes hard to look at an individual study and say, okay, how do I apply this for me, how do I take this study and make a recommendation to you as a producer based on your operation for this one study? And so it's really nice when someone publishes these type of papers. These are called a meta-analysis. And so what they do is they go through and they pull out all the relevant studies that are about on a given topic. In this case, it was vaccination for respiratory viruses in calves. And they establish a set of criteria that those studies have to meet in order to be included in the study. So what that does is it weeds out the ones that weren't conducted in a manner that's scientifically sound. So they get rid of the poorly designed, poorly conducted studies. And then they take all the data out of those studies and put that data through a bunch of mathematical and statistical gymnastics that is far above my head that I don't understand. And then they're able to basically come up with a overall conclusion of what does the data say, what does the literature say on a holistic level about a given topic. And so that's what this study is. It's published in 2015, looking at the value of respiratory virus vaccination in calves for the prevention of bovine respiratory disease, and what is the kind of big picture story from all the different published studies put together. When they did this, they only found 2 field trials that met the criteria for inclusion. So again, those are really hard to conduct. It's hard to conduct those and do them in a manner that's really scientifically sound. And so the opportunity to have those kind of studies to evaluate, and again, these are the ones we want because they have more external validity, there's only 2 of them, so not very many. But what they found is that vaccinated calves had significantly less risk of disease, both sickness and death, compared to non-vaccinated controls. So vaccination helps compared to not vaccinating at all, is what that means. If they look at those experimental challenge studies, again, these are not the field trials, these are the more experimental challenge studies. If they look at modified live IBR and BVD vaccines, they provided a reduction in sickness and death compared to non-vaccinated controls. When they looked at killed BVD vaccines, the vaccine reduced death rate, but it didn't change the rate of animals that got sick. And so it didn't reduce the overall sickness rate, but they did reduce the number of animals that died. And when we look at the data on a BRSV and PI3, vaccination made no difference in this population of studies. Vaccination didn't do anything for those diseases. But again, they're not the most significant ones that we're worried about. We're much more concerned about these typically. So vaccination makes a difference. And based on the challenge studies, modified lives do a better job than killed products, which kind of fits our dogma and what we typically think. There wasn't enough data in these field trials to make any comparisons between modified live and killed products. So in general, if we look at the large body of literature looking at modified live versus killed products, there's a significant, in most cases, to the modified live vaccines over killed. And that holds true if we're talking about calves and respiratory disease. It typically also holds true if we're talking about reproductive vaccines in cows. There's an immunologic advantage to using modified live vaccines, and that makes sense because those vaccines replicate in the animal and they more closely mimic a natural infection compared to the killed products. If we compare modified live to modified live, try to decide, okay, which one should we buy? There aren't a lot of studies that do that. It's hard to get those studies funded, and the ones that there are, most of them don't find a difference. So for most of you are cow-calf producers or stalker producers, there's not a big difference whether you buy vaccine A or vaccine B from a different company. They're very similar products, and most of them are pretty good products. But there's not a big difference in one of them. There are some labeling differences in a few of them, but overall the difference is not that great. If you're a feed yard and you're vaccinating 200,000 animals a year, then you might see some differences, because there may be some very slight differences that you can find if you get those massive numbers, but for most of you, you're not going to see a difference from one vaccine to another for the most part. If we take that same kind of study and now look at it for the respiratory bacteria, that's what this paper was. And it's a little older, 2012 study, but looking at what does the overall body of research say about bacterial vaccination for respiratory disease. And so what they found when we looked at field trials is that there's a potential benefit due to reduction in morbidity. It wasn't as convincing as it was with the viral vaccines. So for the Mannheimia hemolytica and the Pasteurella multocida, there's potential benefit there for reduction in morbidity. There was no benefit, no evidence for benefit of any of the Histophilus somni vaccines. So for any of the vaccines that contain Somnus or Somni, if you're familiar with those products, they provided no benefit at all based on what's available in the published literature. When we look at challenge studies for Mannheimia, they showed increased survival rate for vaccinates, and when the lungs were examined and those animals went to slaughter, the vaccinates had lower lung lesion scores. So the vaccine did provide some advantage there in those challenge studies. But when we went back to these field trials that are more externally valid, they indicated potential benefit due to a little bit reduction in morbidity, but it wasn't as clear-cut as we would like it to be. And then this one really surprised me when I found this paper. It's in the same journal as the previous one, but it's looking at what is the evidence for the value of blackleg vaccination of cattle. And that's something I think most of you probably use blackleg vaccines. I tell my veterinary students, if you can convince your clients to only use one vaccine, make it a blackleg vaccine because they're cheap, they're very effective, and one dead calf from blackleg would buy a whole bunch of vaccine, right? But when we go to the literature and look at what's out there in terms of published studies, it was really surprising and kind of concerning in that there are very few quality studies. The experimental challenge models showed anywhere from 50 to 100% protection, and the field trials didn't show any difference in vaccinates versus controls. That could be for a variety of reasons. I mean, it could be that in those field trial settings, we know, you might go years and never see a blackleg case, and so the level of challenge may not have been high enough to find a difference, but I have to go back and look at the individual studies to see how they were conducted. But kind of surprising, because I just kind of always thought about these vaccines as being really effective and doing a good job, and I think they probably do. This is probably a function of study design and biology of the disease as to why they were able to show a difference. So I'm not to the point that I quit recommending using these vaccines, because again, I think if you lose one calf to blackleg, you could have paid for a year's worth of vaccine. So I think they're still important to use. We just lack real good studies to really validate their efficacy for the most part. We're going to talk a little bit now about vaccinating nursing calves, and then we'll shift gears and talk about vaccinating calves pre-weaning which would be more applicable to stocker calves. There's certainly a relationship between the two. So in general, I think it's better to vaccinate calves, get your calves vaccinated prior to weaning. Timing is important. When we start talking about these disease processes, timing is important. Developing an immune response takes time, and so timing is very critical. So one of the advantages of vaccinating calves when they're still on the cow is that they're not stressed. They haven't been weaned, they haven't been shipped, they haven't been commingled, they're not dealing with all that stress, so we aren't asking a suppressed, compromised immune system to respond to vaccines. So they should have a better opportunity to respond. We know that the biggest challenge in terms of disease risk comes just prior or just after weaning, right? When they're weaned, they're shipped, they're stressed. That's when we see most of our sickness. And it takes time for immune response to develop. If we use a modified live vaccine and that calf responds to that vaccine on the first injection, it takes a minimum of 2 weeks for them to get protective immunity, at a minimum of 2 weeks. If we're utilizing a killed vaccine, they don't get any protective immunity from the first dose. We come back 3 to 4 weeks later, give the second dose, and then it takes an additional 2 weeks after that before they get protective immunity. So there's a delay in time we give the vaccine until they're protected. So waiting until calves are at weaning to vaccinate them puts them behind because they don't have time to establish their immune response before they're going to face the biggest disease challenge, period. There's a variety of ways to go about vaccinating calves pre-breeding. What I generally tell my students is that I like to recommend to my clients that you vaccinate calves twice before you wean them, and I don't have a real strong preference on how you get that done, but I think some key components are twice before weaning, with the second one ideally a month before weaning, a minimum of 2 weeks before weaning, so they've got time to develop some immune response before you wean them. And then when you give the first one is going to vary depending on how you manage the calves and when you have access to them. We'll talk about some more here in just a little bit. I think maybe the next best option is to give them one vaccine prior to weaning and then give a booster at weaning, but then you're still 2 weeks behind. You're still going to have to wait 2 weeks to get that immune response. So if you're keeping calves at home, if you're keeping your home-raised calves at home, that can work pretty well. And I have some clients that do that, and it works fine because those calves experience minimal challenge and minimal stress because they're staying at home. For those calves that are going to be sold and commingled and shipped, that vaccine right before they get on the truck isn't going to do them a lot of good because they're going to be facing a disease challenge before their immune system has a chance to build up immunity. And then probably the least effective scenario is to wait until weaning to start vaccination because then we're several weeks before they are going to be protected and they're heading right into the period of time when the disease challenge is the highest. So getting calves vaccinated prior to weaning has a big advantage, but it has some challenges too, and we'll talk about those. This is the biggest one. So we know that we want calves to get colostrum when they're born, right? That's very important. We know that's very important. That immunity they get from colostrum sticks around for a variable period of time. It may stick around for 2 or 3 months. It may stick around for 10 months. It all depends on how much they get when they're a calf. It depends on what challenges they've faced and how much of that immunity's been used up because of disease challenge. So there's a variety of things that impact how long that immunity lasts, but that immunity can complicate our calf vaccine programs to some degree. And so when we give vaccines to nursing calves, particularly really young nursing calves, we have to think about what impact is that colostral immunity going to have, and is it going to interfere with our vaccine response? And so there's evidence that it can. So the majority of studies that look at vaccinating young pre-weaned calves find that whether we're using a killed or modified live, we don't produce seroconversion. What that means is we can't measure an increase in the antibody titer in those calves. So the traditional way we measure an immune response is we draw a blood sample from a calf, measure its antibody titer, give it a vaccine, and then come back sometime later and measure the antibody titer again. And what you expect to see is a 4-fold increase in the antibody titer, and that tells you that calf responded to that vaccine and made a good immune response. We don't see that when we vaccinate calves that have maternal antibody. Another challenge that we have to be careful about when we look at studies used to get labels, many times, most of those are done in calves that don't have any existing immunity to those pathogens. So if we're going to do a BVD study, a BVD vaccine study, it's usually going to be done in calves that don't have any BVD immunity. And so they're naive to that BVD. And so we can see exactly what the vaccine does. And that's important to know, but that's not applicable to real life in most circumstances, right? Because we hope most of our calves have some immunity on board, and so we have to deal with this process of it interfering. So they don't produce an antibody titer, but There may be some other advantages and other benefits to vaccinating them there, even though we can't measure a change in antibody titer. Some studies show that it slows down the rate at which those antibodies decay, so their antibodies last longer, they stay around longer, so the calf's protected for longer. The big one that I've always kind of leaned on is that if we use modified live products in those calves, we may not see an antibody titer rise, but there is a handful of studies that show they induce what's called a cell-mediated immune response. It's another type of immune response. It's actually more important from a standpoint of fighting viral disease. And so some of those calves will produce a CMI response even though we can't measure a change in the antibody titer. But that's not consistent across every study. There are other studies that don't show an effect there. There are studies that show that vaccination may result in immune priming even though we don't see a change in antibody titer. And then there's some that actually went back and challenged those calves with disease some point after vaccination. And in some studies the calves were protected and others they weren't. So the challenge here is that the results from the studies that look at this are all highly variable, and they depend on a lot of different factors. And so it's very difficult to look at all this and make one concrete recommendation about when should we vaccinate calves because the studies are so variable. One way that we try to get around that potentially is with use with intranasal vaccination. So the reason that we look at these is because we squirt that virus in the nose, and there's a different immune response in the nasal passages that isn't impacted by circulating antibody in the animal. And so we think maybe we can get an immune response there that isn't as impacted by the maternal immunity. And that's true in some cases, but again, the results of studies are really variable. It does seem that intranasal vaccination is not as impacted by maternal antibody. They can induce an immune response, but they tend to be short-lived compared to immune responses produced by injected vaccine. And the conclusions on efficacy are difficult to make because there's so much variability in those studies. And so in some studies there was an advantage to using the intranasal products. Some studies there was no advantage at all. But they might be an option. So there's something to consider, particularly if we're going to be vaccinating really young calves. The risk of maternal antibody interference is reduced with intranasal vaccination. The other thing you got to consider if you're going to utilize modified live products in nursing calves is there are some safety concerns that are there potentially. If you read the labels of those products, there's at least 4 different product lines that are modified live vaccines that are labeled for use in pregnant cows. Those products will also say on their label that you can use them in nursing calves as long as the cow is getting the same vaccine. So the concern there is that we vaccinate this calf with this live virus, that virus replicates and that calf sheds some of that virus and exposes his mother who's already pregnant again, and we might put that pregnancy at risk. And that can happen. It did happen more so with some of the original modified live products, but as our technology has improved and stuff, the risk of that happening now is very, very low. There's some studies that have looked at that and tried to find shedding in vaccinated calves. And some studies don't find any, and some find a very, very small amount of virus there, but probably not enough to be a concern. So if the cow herd has any immunity at all, you're probably pretty safe to still go in and utilize those modified live products in those nursing calves, even if the cows are getting a killed vaccine. But you want to discuss that with your veterinarian and be aware of that is an extra label use of that vaccine. And so if you do induce an abortion in a cow by doing that, that vaccine company is not going to stand behind that product in that case because you used it in a way that's not on label. So there's some risk there. So I do this in some herds, and in some herds we don't do it. It just depends on the client. But I think the modified lives do offer an immunologic advantage, but they do bring some safety concerns that we've got to be cognizant of and think about too. And this is one of the other examples of why it's so important to work with your veterinarian who knows your herd and knows your management system so they can help you kind of build a tailored kind of custom vaccine program because there is no kind of one-size-fits-all program. Given all that, the optimal timing for vaccines in nursing calves depends on several factors. So if we know a calf did not get colostrum, then that calf should respond to vaccine even at a few weeks of age. And so if you have a calf, maybe the cow dies during labor or something and the calf doesn't get colostrum, that calf's got a challenge ahead of it because we know their risk of disease is a lot higher. But they would be a good opportunity to go in and vaccinate those guys much earlier in life than you might vaccinate the other typical calves because these guys don't have any maternal antibody to interfere with their vaccine response. Hopefully that's a very, very small number of calves that happens in. But if you have some reason to suspect that the colostral transfer of immunity in those calves is not optimal, then maybe vaccinating earlier in life it has an advantage. Vaccination of the cow herd is something that we need to think about. And we don't often think about that in relation to how we're going to vaccinate our calves. And so, but we need to start thinking about it as we learn more about this interference of maternal immunity, that maybe if our cow herd is really well vaccinated, then we can make the assumption that they're putting a lot of antibody in their colostrum, and maybe we need to wait longer before we start vaccinating our calves so that maternal antibody has decreased some more and doesn't interfere with our vaccine as much. If our cow herd's not vaccinated at all, maybe we push those calf vaccines up earlier in life to get those calves protected a little more early, because they're probably not getting the same level of colostral immunity. Or maybe even if you go through a period of time, go through a drought when cows are pregnant and they're not in good body condition and they're not making a lot of colostrum, then we might go back in and vaccinate those calves a little earlier in life than we might otherwise when calves are getting good colostrum. All right, so then if we shift gears and think about weaned calves, if we look at a lot of the older studies as far as vaccine timing in weaned calves or stocker calves, most of this is done in stocker calves, looking at do we vaccinate them when they arrive or do we wait? A lot of the older studies don't show any difference, but there's a growing body of evidence that delaying vaccination may be beneficial. And if we think about it, it makes sense, because we've got these, again, if you're talking about this is in high-risk calves, so those lightweight, freshly weaned, commingled calves, they're stressed, right? We don't like to vaccinate them then because they're stressed, they're not going to respond well. So it makes sense that maybe delaying that vaccine might actually be a big benefit, because they're not going to respond to that vaccine, so we're kind of wasting time and money giving it to them, and we're also maybe adding additional stress to them at a time when they're already pretty stressed. So I'm going to show you a couple of studies that kind of add some support to that. This is one, it's a 2007 study, so it's an older study. But what they did, they went in and gave calves, these are lightweight, high-risk calves. Some of them got vaccinated with a modified live vaccine on arrival at the stocker operation, and some of them they waited till day 14 to vaccinate them. Everything else was the same. And the calves that had the delayed vaccine actually gained more weight. They had statistically different weight gains, higher weight gains in the calves that got vaccinated on day 14. There was no difference in sickness rate, days to first treatment, total treatment cost, or death loss. So these values were numerically greater for the day 14 vaccines, but they weren't different enough to reach what we call statistical significance. So that result might have just been from chance. But the important part of that, I think, is that they didn't lose anything. They gained additional weight by waiting, and they didn't lose anything in terms of health response by waiting 14 days to vaccinate those calves. Waiting till those calves are acclimated to their new environment, they're not as stressed, they're over the challenge of shipping, gives those calves maybe a better opportunity to respond to vaccine. And there was no difference in their morbidity rate. So they didn't lose anything by waiting in terms of health, and they actually had some higher weight gains in those calves. This one was similar. So this one actually had over 5,000 animals in this study, very large study. They vaccinated them either on day 0 or day 30, compared the differences. And what they found here is when they delayed vaccination to day 30, they treated fewer of those calves twice. So they had fewer BRD repulls if they waited to vaccinate them than if they vaccinated them on arrival. The sickness rate, the death rate, and the case fatality rate were all numerically better when they vaccinated them on day 30, but again, they didn't quite reach that level of statistical significance. But again, there was no difference. They didn't lose anything by waiting 30 days to vaccinate those calves. And then this one actually is a 2016 study, pretty recent study. There's some concern that giving these modified live vaccines to these lightweight, high-risk calves when they're stressed actually may have some safety concerns associated with it. It may actually cause harm, not just fail to do good. So our main concern is that we're failing to do anything good with the vaccine, but there's maybe some evidence that we're actually maybe doing harm in some circumstances. This was a pretty complicated study. They were looking at deworming practices as well, but one of the things they measured was comparing modified live vaccination at arrival or no vaccination at all. So they didn't give any vaccine, or they got vaccine at arrival. We'd expect that these calves are going to fall apart, right? They're going to have all kinds of sickness and issues. But what they found was the opposite. When they gave those vaccines on day 0 in high-risk calves, they had more sickness, more death loss, reduced growth compared to calves that got no vaccination at all. And so there's some concerns about taking these high-risk calves and putting modified live vaccines in them, both from a standpoint of their ability to respond to those vaccines, but also in that is a live virus. And normally what happens is that it replicates, but the immune system keeps it from replicating to the point that it can cause an issue. but when their immune system is stressed and not functioning like it should, maybe that virus can kind of go wild and cause some issues. It didn't cause clinical disease necessarily in these, but in terms of viral disease, but they did have higher BRD morbidity and mortality. So something to think about is maybe there's some advantage to, in high-risk calves, waiting and delaying those vaccines for 2 weeks to maybe 30 days, until the time when those calves are not as stressed, and that gives them a better chance to respond to the vaccine and maybe eliminates this concern of potential safety risk or doing harm with the vaccine.